In 1940, 3,000 RAF pilots fought in the Battle of Britain, many with just a few hours' experience flying a Spitfire or Hurricane. In this series, 4 young pilots are competing for the chance to be trained as a Battle of Britain pilot. After a week flying on Tiger Moths, only 2 now survive. They will now battle for the ultimate prize, 9 hours at the controls of a real World War II Spitfire. For the first part of their challenge, our 4 pilots spent last week at Headcorn Airfield in Kent, testing their flying skills on a 1930s Tiger Moth. Exactly the aircraft many of the Battle of Britain veterans used for their basic training before the war. The 2 pilots who came through were RAF trainee John Sweet and private pilot David Mallon. They're now at Duxford, one of the key airfields used in the Battle of Britain, and now home to Carolyn Grace's unique aircraft, a 1944 Mark IX Spitfire that saw action on D-Day and was converted after the war into a 2-seat trainer. Last week, she gave them both a taste of what it is to fly a Spitfire. This week, they will be trying to prove to her that it should be them going forward to the same 9-hour operational training course that many of their 1940s counterparts received prior to the Battle of Britain.
The shadow of the conquering German armies covered Western Europe. The self-styled master race was riding high.
Back in May 1940, British pilots were about to find themselves on the front line. Hitler's armies had swept across the continent. Britain's turn was next. 3,000 fighter pilots were all that stood in the way. Their job would be to stop the Luftwaffe in its tracks. The next 4 months would make heroes out of the RAF. A process that the succeeding decades have done nothing to diminish.
I was a schoolboy a few months before, and now I was in the thick of it. I'd never seen anything like it before, and I couldn't believe my luck, really.
But it's pretty hazardous game, and very exciting, I must confess.
You were blue-eyed boys. The Brill Cream boys, as they called us.
When the battle finally started in July 1940, these Brill Cream boys had much to learn. In this programme, we'll look at the first month of the battle and the ferocious baptism of fire suffered by the young pilots, as they discovered if they had what it took to survive, never mind shoot planes down. Last week, Dave and John had the chance to familiarise themselves with the controls of a World War II fighter. Now they need to fly it for themselves. Their first priority is to learn how to fly straight and level, then how to climb and dive, and finally, how to fly the Spitfire in steep turns. Only then will they be ready to move on to more complicated manoeuvres.
Again, you need to be at one with the aeroplane. It's absolutely imperative that you are that, because if you are going into battle, you don't want to have to be thinking about how to fly the aeroplane, so that when you go into the aerobatic side and the formation side, flying the aeroplane is not a problem.
Germany overran France in short order, bringing her to her knees in barely 6 weeks. The invasion of Britain seemed inevitable, but even the triumphant Germans knew they would have to tame the RAF before even thinking about crossing the Channel. On the 30th of June 1940, Goering issued the order, smash the RAF. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. Pre-war RAF pilots had had months flying their Hurricanes and Spitfires, notching up hundreds of hours in training. But there were far too few of them, so new pilots were given crash courses, joining their squadrons often with less than 10 hours at the controls of a fighter. The same amount of training that our 2 pilots are competing for. They were all, without exception, very, very young.
Okay, you have control.
I have control.
Within 10 months of leaving school, raising my hat to the headmaster, within 10 months I was in the Spitfire squadron.
Imagine passing your driving test, being allowed to drive for a few days, and then enter for a Grand Prix race against the best drivers in the world on a racing circuit. And by the way, if you lose, you'll probably be crippled or dead. So you better learn fast. That's about the size of the challenge that these kids, and they were kids, we're talking about 18, 19, 20-year-olds, faced in the summer of 1940.
With the training, it's learning to fly the aircraft. I imagine most of the actual skills in the fighting is learned once you got sent to a squadron, and speaking to the experienced pilots there, you would learn tricks.
Bring it back down to 2400 because I've got +4. Okay. Slightly pulled down. I'm going to put the main tank off now.
Leave out the way.
At 1500 feet. Good lookout, and the gear is definitely up.
The attacks began in early July 1940. First came nuisance raids designed to probe British defences, while the main German attacks were directed at Channel shipping. The plan was to destroy valuable convoys and to draw the RAF up into the air, where the Luftwaffe was convinced they would make easy prey for their Messerschmitts. The first major clashes occurred on the 10th of July. Battle had been joined. From the beginning, it was clear that the RAF was different from the other armed services. Fighter pilots knew they were an elite and revelled in it. But it was an elite built on ability, not just social background. Fighter Command drew its pilots from a wide variety of men.
The image of the fighter pilot on the British side is of a rather languid public schoolboy, and doesn't care about discipline very much, and doesn't take his job terribly seriously, but manages to shoot down hordes of German aircraft because of his innate superiority in breeding. But Fighter Command, in fact, was much more diverse than that. About 1/3 were sons of tradesmen, of butchers, of farmers from Manchester and Liverpool, as well as from rural Gloucestershire and Sussex. And so the class barriers, which were endemic in British society at the time, actually began to break down rather faster in the RAF under the pressures of combat than they did in civilian society as a whole.
But what was more important than the variety in their backgrounds was the strength of their common purpose.
We tend to forget how young they were, often at 18, 19, early 20s. So they're driven, they're energetic, they're enthusiastic. They seem to have some incredible morale and fighting spirit which drives them on. At a time when there's desperate need, when we're threatened with invasion, when the major cities are being bombed, when it doesn't look as if Britain will necessarily survive as an independent nation.
Discovering one evening when I went to see my wife that she'd been sitting at her dressing table putting on her lipstick with the window wide open, and some clumsy chap had dropped a bomb not far away, and a piece of shrapnel came in through the open window and smashed her mirror. Well, that wasn't playing fair, I didn't reckon, and it was time to do something about it.
The reason I did it, I didn't want those bastards in my mum's backyard, in a nutshell. I saw no reason why they should come here, and I had every intention of stopping them coming here. I think a boy thinks like that, doesn't he?
Civilian pilot Dave Mallon is flying his second hour of Spitfire training. At this stage, his instructor Carolyn is instilling in him the basics of level flight, climbing and diving, as well as the art of the tight turn. These have to become second nature should Dave ever need to enter combat.
Try and maintain your height, so choose a height you want to maintain. 2-7, yeah. Keep this turn going. And now just revert it around the other direction. No problem. And reverse it back the other way.
Back in July 1940, the pilots of Fighter Command were discovering just how limited their training had been. Nobody had prepared them for the shock of meeting the enemy for real.
When I looked over to my right, I saw some aeroplanes with swastikas on them, or crosses they were from that position, flying below there. And I called up and I said, oh, I can see some aircraft down there with crosses on. And my leader said, that's a bloody enemy, you fool.
I just saw these yellow-nosed aircraft going past me, and I was actually, believe it or not, admiring them. They looked so pretty, and I suddenly realised that that was the enemy. So I started firing at them. By that time, someone had got onto my tail, and that was the end of my first encounter. They shot me down.
The yellow-nosed Messerschmitt 109 was the mainstay of the Luftwaffe fighter force and a formidable opponent.
It was nice to see it below you when it hadn't spotted you, but it was nasty to see it behind you. That was quite unnerving.
Although a fine aircraft, the 109 was much harder to fly than the Hurricane or Spitfire, a real disadvantage in the rush to get novices up into the air.
When I was at Duxford and saw some German pilots, I said, do you know why the Spitfire was a better aeroplane than the Messerschmitt 109? And they said no. And I said, any idiot could fly a Spitfire, but it took a lot of training to fly a 109.
Unfortunately for the RAF, German pilots were among the best in the world, many of them battle-hardened.
On the English side, there were good pilots, but they had no experience of war. On our side, of course, we had men who had been in combat. They had flown in Spain, or like me, in the war against Poland.
For most in Fighter Command, this would be their first experience of fighting at all. One of the most vivid accounts of what it is like was written by a young pilot called Richard Hillary. The book he wrote, The Last Enemy, became a classic, and he was later to record it for radio.
On the day after my arrival, I had my first taste of them. As we got the order to take off and I climbed hurriedly into the cockpit of my machine, I felt an empty sensation of suspense in the pit of my stomach. For 1 second, time seemed to stand still, and I stared blankly in front of me. For I knew that that morning I was to kill for the first time. And we were off.
For RAF squadrons comprising of a dozen planes, the first shock was coming up against formations of German aircraft numbering in the hundreds. The result was chaos and confusion, requiring lightning-quick reflexes.
It was a melee, it wasn't a dogfight. Dogfighting ceased in the First World War as the airplanes got faster.
Airplanes going in all directions, all over the place.
So you spent most of your time trying to avoid running into someone.
The 109 had flashed past you.
To keep him in your sights, to have a chance of shooting him down, 2 seconds was too long.
You may turn and fire your gun.
It wouldn't be one continuous burst, it would just be... Brrr.
You couldn't really do much more than have a squirt.
Bullets were flying everywhere.
Most fights were all over in minutes, question of minutes, and then, as I say, everything was empty. So you just said, thank Christ for that, and went home.
You can have bullet holes when you get back, and you can say, oh, good God, where did those come from? In fact, I picked up a spent bullet from the bottom of the cockpit once, and no idea where it came from.
We hear a lot in modern wars about friendly fire, and it was rife during the Battle of Britain. My examination of the records suggests that there were no less than 36 British aircraft shot down by their own side.
I'm quite sure it was another Spitfire that did me in, because I saw this other aircraft and I turned to display my wing plan, which was the obvious one because the 109s had straight-edged wings, cut off at the tip. The Spitfire had this elliptical wing, so that was an instant recognition for him, so I let him see it. But that was too late, and he'd shot off his bolt and it hit me in the petrol tank.
When you think of the speed at which events are occurring, if you think of the confusion of a dogfight, if you think that all you've probably got to go on is a glimpse of a silhouette, what are you going to do? Are you going to open fire or are you not going to open fire? Well, quite a lot of the time they open fire, and a lot of the time they actually hit them.
The only thing to be done is get out of the barbecue as quickly as possible. The flames were coming out and sort of burning off my uniform and a bit of me in the process. And the next thing I knew, I was floating down through the air without an aircraft.
Other pilots were luckier. On their very first sorties, they found themselves shooting down enemy planes as if by accident.
We were flying along in formation and saw a lot of black specks, which I thought was oil on the windscreen. They turned out to be 109s coming in the opposite direction. And one of them passed over my head by about 20 feet or so. You could see the oil streaks, I vividly remember, under his engine and almost count the rivets. I fired at him, and to my great surprise, he caught fire. And I was a bit horrified. Gosh, how did I do that?
So on my first sortie, I shot down 2 aircraft without knowing what was happening in the sky about me, why it was happening, or who was doing what to whom. I should have been shot down and killed myself.
We ran into them at 18,000 feet, 20 yellow-nosed Messerschmitt 109s, about 100 feet above us. And as they came down on us, we went into line astern and turned head on to them. I kicked the rudder to the left to get him at right angles, turned the gun button to fire, and let go in a 4-second burst with full deflection. He came right through my sights, and I saw the tracer from all 8 guns thud home. For a second, he seemed to hang motionless. A jet of red flame shot upwards, and he spun into the ground. It had happened. I realized then that I had felt neither pity nor sorrow for that man. If I were to die, I asked nothing better than to go the same way.
The controls of the Spitfire are very simple, especially compared to a modern aircraft.
The first thing we come to is the control column, and the top of this control column is a lovely spade stick, and we use this to roll the aircraft to the right using our ailerons, and then to pitch the aircraft nose down to dive we push forward, which uses our elevators at the rear of the aircraft. However, if we were to use the controls this roughly and fly, we wouldn't be in for a nice time. Generally it's just very gentle like that and nose up. And then to left, it's almost, you've got to think to go left, and then just a tiniest little bit like that will gently bring us round to the left and again to the right. It's very, very gentle. We have our altimeter, which shows us our altitude, and we have our airspeed indicator, which on this aircraft runs around twice to 350 knots. We also have, for the fighter pilot, we have the guns, which you press there, or the cannons. If the pilot was in a position where he definitely needed the kill, and he was very sure he was going to get the kill, he'd be able to unload both.
Most Spitfires didn't get cannons until after the Battle of Britain. In 1940, they were equipped with 8 machine guns, 4 in each wing. This was potent firepower, except for the fact that few pilots were ever actually trained in how to really use them.
We were given 20 rounds per gun each and told to go farther into the North Sea. Well, you couldn't really miss the North Sea. And that's the only gunnery we did.
A skilled pilot, who is also a marksman, is thinking entirely about how he's going to control this machine as part of himself, as if he's swinging a shotgun in the sky. And instead of tracking an aircraft by moving the gun around, he's actually using the controls to do the same thing, because essentially what he is doing is using it to point in the direction he needs to get the right shot to deliver some deadly blows.
You've got to aim your guns ahead of the enemy aircraft in order to shoot it down, as following a pheasant that I had done, bringing a gun through the pheasant.
You don't shoot at it, you shoot somewhere over here. It's extremely unnatural. Either it's 109s or pheasants. Pheasants are safer.
These machine guns didn't just fire straight ahead, but were placed at a slight angle to make the bullets converge at the point calculated to cause maximum damage.
Guns of a Spitfire were harmonized at 250 yards, so you get the strongest bullet group at 250 yards. You get a spread of about 3 feet across.
If you are at that point and the fighter fires at you, that's curtain for you, completely. Because of the mass of bullets all together in one lump.
However, experienced pilots thought 250 yards was too far away and had their guns synchronized even closer.
I had my guns towed in to 150 yards as not to provide a spread, but to provide a pinpoint, so that all the guns were supposed to, all the bullets should have bounced off each other at 150 yards. Well, that meant if you got in close, you were really hitting hard.
Air warfare, particularly between fighters, is not about two equals dueling. It's not like a couple of knights running against each other, being equally armed. It's about ambushing someone. It's creeping up unseen and shooting someone in the back.
I myself was a specialist at shooting from directly behind, as close in as I could get. And then I would dip slightly, aim at the plane's back side from underneath, and fire a quick burst.
I think about 80% of the people during the Battle of Britain were shot down by people they didn't even see.
It's much more like hunting, and you sought out prey that were defenseless if you possibly could. So it wasn't very romantic at all, in fact.
So that would be the challenge faced by Dave and John with their handful of hours training. Would they be the hunter, or would they be the hunted?
You're getting better, Dave.
Practice makes perfect.
The people who got killed first were new pilots posted in who'd only done about 5-7 hours flying on Spitfires. And many of them got killed on their first trip.
It was sad to think we were strapping a man or a young man in the cockpit, younger than one yourself, and sending him up to fight experienced pilots like Galland and that, you know, the Germans.
There's an unpleasant but apt phrase, cannon fodder. Totally inexperienced people were sent into aerial combat. All they knew was how to take off and land. But when they were faced with their first tight turn, they were already in trouble. To send such people into battle with no idea of how to shoot is just wrong. It happened on both sides. And it's a tragedy that they were ever sent up there just to be shot down.
One American study has calculated that most people only have a 50-50 chance of getting through each of their first 5 combats, but that if they do, their chances of survival rise by a factor of 10, 20 or more.
So for our trainee pilots, life would have been brutally simple. Learn as much as you could in 9 hours of Spitfire training, and then hope you can make it through those first vital hours. Carolyn has decided to show Dave and John what the Spitfire can do in the hands of an expert.
Whoa. Give it a rudder. Keep the turn going.
Combat flying puts enormous demands on the human body, something our pilots need to experience for themselves. The greatest strain is the pressure of G-force when twisting and diving violently, which at their worst can make you lose consciousness, called blacking out.
Well, I wasn't a good enough or experienced pilot at the time to develop any aerodynamic tricks to avoid being shot down. But what I had to my advantage is I could pull aircraft round in a very tight turn and take very strong G-forces. Now, this was possibly due to my being short, because your stomach muscles stop the blood flowing from your head, and when it does, of course, you pass out. But under the stress of combat, you could pull it so hard that you did momentarily black out.
You get any blacking out?
No, not at all, no. In a Spitfire, you could get pretty heavy G coming out at, say, 450 miles an hour in a very steep dive, and you were pulling out. Or if you were in a sharp turn in a dogfight, you could black yourself out as easy as anything.
Oh, every time. Every day in combat. Oh, yeah. Clean as a whistle. I used to start to go just after 5G.
You could feel the blood draining out of your brain, and you got very fuzzy and eventually went unconscious. But you learned to control this to some extent.
A good trick, put your head on your shoulder, and that stopped the direct flow of blood from your head down into your body, and also constricted the arteries and veins somewhat, all of which was a help.
You used to grey out initially. It was sort of, with me, I don't know if it varied with people, but me, it used to grey out like that and come in, and then you go black. You knew what was going on, and if you eased the stick a bit, it would come back. If you kept pulling, then you became unconscious. If you could avoid it, don't black out, because you can't see, and you can't see what's happening. And it only takes 2 or 3 seconds, and he's on you.
Throughout Fighter Command, pilots would work out for themselves what helped them survive. Nothing was too trivial if it gave you the edge you needed.
I'll tell you about the things that can get you killed. Never fly with a cold or a stiff neck.
That's why they wore these silk neck scarves. It wasn't for show or because it was elegant or fashionable. It's to prevent chafing. The Van Huysen shirts that the fighter pilots were issued with were tight and stiff. They also shrank when in contact with the water. So unless you want to be choked in the channel, you undid your top button and you put on the neck scarf.
Never follow the aircraft you're shooting at, because somebody will be shooting at you.
If you stay still, you're a simple target. If you're moving around, you're not. So therefore, let's move around. And if you can't see a target in front of you, doesn't matter. Don't go around looking for one like that. Chuck the aeroplane about, and then one will come up. Survival. Live to fight another day, and have a jolly good bash at him while you're there. Go for him.
Get in fast, kill one of them, and then get out.
For the Germans, the Battle of Britain was simply phase 2 in their lightning war to create a European empire. But as well as defeating Britain, they were also driven by conquest on a personal level, and the medals that went with it.
The Germans are motivated much more by the feeling that they're engaged in some form of dangerous sport. You get the sporting analogies constantly in German correspondence, and what their main concern is how well their unit is doing against other units in terms of shooting down British aircraft. Who's got the best score?
During the Battle of Britain, I was awarded this Knight's Cross for shooting down 20 aircraft. It was a great honour. People respected you wherever you went. People would say, full of admiration, "Look, he has the Knight's Cross." It was something quite special at the time.
The leading aces were known to be people who suffer from what the Germans called Halsweh, or having a sore throat, which simply meant they wanted to feel the weight of a knight's cross dangling around it, so were very anxious to get called off to Berlin for a new award. But it produces a subtle difference, much more individualism on the German side, much less of a sense of moral issues at stake. They were simply a group of professionals who'd been given a job, and so they went about doing it the best they could.
Of course, there were exceptional pilots on the British side too, but Fighter Command frowned on anyone guilty of boasting about being an ace. The most successful RAF pilot during the battle was a South African called Sailor Milan, and his attitude is typical.
I don't really know how many I shot down. Much has been written about the competition between individuals in their quest to be the top scorer. Such competition, in my experience, did not exist. We all did our job, which was to destroy as many enemies as we could. We were not there for personal glory, but as part of a team.
I used not to like the idea of a personal score at all. Not at all. I thought that was a bloody nuisance, that people should be... And it becomes a selfish occupation if you do that. Your aim should be, as a part of your squadron, for help as many of your people to get into a position to make an attack.
In the First World War, if you shot 5 enemy aircraft down, you became an ace. And this was quite significant. It meant that you were a gen man, one of the leaders of the pack. And so I had a private celebration when I'd shot 5 down, had a pint of beer on my own. I never mentioned it to anyone else, so I didn't want to seem silly, really, because it didn't apply in this war, really.
Ace or not, there was no doubting the pedestal on which fighter pilots were placed by the general civilian population.
They didn't know whether you're a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot or a coastal command pilot. The general feeling was we were little heroes.
Well, I suppose in a way we were lucky. We weren't like a poor soldier in a slip trench and in the rain and all the rest of it. We fought hard during the day, and those that were left at the end of the day had an English pub to go to, which we'd done in peacetime. You talk to English locals. It's difficult for anybody to understand. You went from one extreme to the other. 1 minute fighting for your life, next minute having a game of darts. Double top, you know.
So we became rather sort of jolly chaps, you know. Let's have another beer, you know. Let's go after girls.
My new girlfriend at the time was Barbara, which lasted forever because we're now married. And this is when I first met her. She was a very keen sailor. That was the oddest thing, to be in a punt in the afternoon and looking up at the sky and thinking, well, a couple of hours ago I was fighting the bloody enemy up there. Most extraordinary feeling.
Well done this morning. They were nice having the slightly longer sorties.
Having mastered the basic Spitfire handling, Carolyn is now moving on to skills John and Dave would need if they were to enter combat.
Then we'll do a simulated engine failure, and I'll do it and just show you. You see how much the speed drops off. She's quite nice.
Learning about engine failures and glide speeds are essential. Many pilots had to land badly damaged planes.
But trim the aeroplane to fly, trim the rudder, and trim the elevator to fly slightly, a little bit.
It's easy for our pilots to forget what they were being trained to do. Kill other young men much like themselves.
Well, you have to go back to 1937, 36, 37. I used to go to Germany as a boy. I loved them, I really did. I was tremendously impressed by the Germans. Lots of aeroplanes in the sky, which tremendously impressive to a chap aged 17, 16, 17. So that when I fought the chaps in fighters and bombers, they were the same chaps that I met on the ground in Germany. I had no animosity, and the ones we'd shot down and met as captives and very charming fellows.
There was no bad feelings, and I don't think any of the pilots had any bad feelings, because the bloke in that thing with crosses on was only doing the same job as they were for another firm.
Well, when you're a young pilot, when you're a young man, you don't think to yourself, what have you done? Have you killed a man? You just thought, I've brought down an enemy plane.
Du hast ein feindliches Flugzeug abgeschossen.
I shot at aircraft. I didn't shoot at people.
You don't think about the person in it. You can't see him. You're not in close contact with him at all.
Once in a while, though, a pilot might glimpse another human being.
When I shot a bloke down over the sea, he was flying all very close over the sea, and I hit him, and I saw his wheels come down and his hood come off and his engine stopped. And I couldn't have shot him any more than that. It just wasn't in me to go on shooting at him, so I stopped shooting and flew up alongside him, and knowing that he was going to have the crash in the sea, I sort of wished him luck. In fact, I should have shot him down, because he was rescued by his own side, and he came back and shot more of our chaps down. So really, I should have done so. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. It wasn't in me to do it.
However, as the battle continued, rumours started circulating about much darker goings-on.
There was a big battle one day, and we were all watching, of course, and a parachute came out, and we recognised it was from one of our own aeroplanes. And to our horror, a German came in and shot him to pieces on the way down.
There are a number of incidents on both sides where it was reported that pilots were deliberately shot at. Very few of those can actually be confirmed. One of the few cases which can be confirmed is of German pilots who were deliberately attacked when on parachutes by one RAF squadron, the Poles.
Poland had suffered far greater brutality at German hands than even France had, and it showed.
The Poles were fighting a different war. They were fighting the Eastern War, a no-holds-barred war. They'd seen Warsaw burn. Their country was occupied. They didn't know what had happened to their relatives. Their relatives might already have been carted off. And whilst the British were out to shoot down aeroplanes, the Poles were out to kill Germans. And whether they were in the aeroplanes or out of them was neither here nor there to them.
Well, we were very united. We just hated the enemy, and then all we wanted is to get at him and shoot him.
The two pilots I think a lot of us had more respect for than anybody else were both Poles, Joe Klein and Slagowski. When nobody else would fly, they wanted to. And at Middle Wallop one day, it was a peace super, the birds were walking. And over came a Jerry, and we could hear it above this lot, buzzing the field. We didn't know whether he was going to just buzz off or drop something. And these two Poles were out and into the cockpit, screaming and shouting at the CO to let him go. No, no, no. And off he went back inside to the ground crew, away, and off they went into this fog. They hadn't gone 10 yards, they disappeared. They got airborne, there were no runways. They knew there were nothing in front of them for at least half a mile, except two hangars, and they were airborne. And they disappeared. The CO was biting lumps out of everything. And then we heard this Jerry come over. I mean, they were most distinctive sound Jerrys. We heard him come over, and immediately behind it, two Spitfires, and they were both firing at it. There were bullets everywhere, you know, and they shot it down. And when they landed, were they in trouble? But that's why we liked them. They were there to do a job, and nothing was going to stop them. The Poles were brilliant.
They have their glory to fight for, and then we have our survival to fight for.
In his third hour of Spitfire training, Dave is being taught how to link up a series of turns, as well as how to glide the plane in the event of an engine failure.
Find that okay?
Yeah, you realise how it picks up height as soon as it goes back to straight and level, even when you just translate through straight and level.
Yeah.
Our pilots are now close to the point where one of them will be chosen for the full 9-hour Spitfire training course, and one will be on his way home. Back in 1940, as the battle got underway, the pilots were confronted with a far starker reality. As the July air fighting over the Channel intensified, it became clear just what the odds facing the pilots were. 1 in 6 of them would be killed. Russian roulette odds.
In the morning, you'd all have breakfast together. And you know quite well you wouldn't all be having supper that night together. That was very, very sad.
I have a photograph of Sammy Hogg, and that's Pat Learmond. My best friends, really, I suppose. Sad to say, they were both killed in the first few months of the war. And because they are silhouettes, it seems to be an omen of the future in some way. And it was heartrending.
The second day that we were in operation, the whole of B Flight was shot down. They weren't all killed, fortunately. There were only 2 of them killed. But you were constantly aware of what might happen.
It's a strange thing to look back on it and think, well, why didn't we grieve more for the chaps that were missing? And you never knew whether they'd been killed or whether they'd jumped out or whether they'd crash-landed. And by the time the news came through that they had been killed, so much had happened in between that it had no effect on you whatsoever. None.
We had one new wife, the famous case where she came and camped outside the airfield for a month after her husband was shot down, and she never believed he wouldn't come back, but he didn't. His body was washed up and he was buried with military honours and so on.
You couldn't take any of these things to heart. I mean, the sort of ideas, the stories you heard of First World War Royal Flying Corps days when they set an empty place at the table, sort of thing, for the chap who was missing. You didn't play those sort of games. You just said, there it is. Thank God it wasn't me.
To us, we'd lost a pilot. We'd lost an aeroplane. Get on with the job.
For the pilots who were left to get on with the job, those initial 9 hours of training would grow very, very quickly. Pilots were on duty from dawn till dusk. During the long July days, this meant being on duty from 3 in the morning till 10 at night, usually flying 2, 3, or even 4 times a day. Their enemy was exhaustion.
My overriding memory of the Battle of Britain, they'll stay with me longer than anything else, was of abject tiredness. You sat down and you were asleep.
I slept through a bombing raid on the airfield and the anti-aircraft fire against the German bombers, and didn't realise anything until I was wakened up in the morning and looked out of the window and saw this line of bomb craters across the garden outside the mess.
The one thing that would cut through this exhaustion was the adrenaline brought on by their other constant companion, fear.
Good gracious me, of course we're frightened, if that's the right word to use. But you know, when you jump in that airplane and start that Merlin engine and there's a big roar and a bang and off you go, you haven't the time to be frightened.
You can't go up there and fight for your life if you're terrified. You can't do anything if you're terrified. You can't even go gardening. If you're terrified, you can't be terrified. No, apprehensive, yes.
The worst time was waiting, sitting on the ground waiting. As soon as the alarm went, that was it, rush to your aircraft. One of my pilots used to pause on the way, be violently sick on the grass, and then climb into his aircraft, and we were off. That's how it affected him.
We didn't fear death. We accepted that it could happen. What we did fear was being wounded or taken prisoner of war.
Being burnt was the one thing. I saw so many of people burnt, and In my squadron, quite a few were burnt.
It's never going to happen to you. That is what you live with. Because I think if you lived with anything else and you were thought, God, I'm frightened, I'm going to do this, you couldn't work it out. You couldn't live with it. It's never going to happen to you.
But of course it did happen. It happened to the 600 fighter pilots who died in the battle, to the hundreds more who were wounded and burned, and to the lovers and wives, and to the families who lost their sons.
What a waste of lives, money and time. You just go out there and drop bombs on a factory, killing people, for what?
I can remember sitting in the bath and floods of tears for a great friend of mine had gone. It still bothers me. Lots of good people, and of course some very good friends. When they go, then it's obviously unnecessary. But there it is, nothing you can do about it.
At Duxford Aerodrome, it's time for Carolyn Grace to decide which of her pupils will go forward to advanced Spitfire training. John Sweet from the RAF or Dave Mallon from Manchester Flying Club.
Very difficult decision. There's nothing between them. They are both outstanding individuals. After the first flight with both of them, I decided to do a points system because it's the only objective way of actually coming up with a clear decision. Dave has a particularly obedient streak in him. He's very concerned about getting things exactly right. And I particularly like his way of questioning. And he will question until he is happy with the result. John has the edge on him with physical flying, but only a very small edge, only about a point. So my decision, and with clear 6 points in the lead out of 200 odd points, it is Dave. I think that Dave will be the one that will always bring the aeroplane back and always just come back, land and go into the squadron bar and say, oh, well done, chaps. He's very much a squadron pilot, so that's what I feel.
Yeah, I've had 3 hours in the Spitfire now, and it was fantastic fun. I'll probably never experience anything like it again, but it was really worthwhile, even just for the 3 hours. It was fantastic.
Very pleased with myself. I'm going to have a few more hours on this lovely aircraft, which I've been really, really enjoying myself on. It's going to be excellent. I'm really looking forward to it.
Next week, Dave Mallon flies the Spitfire into the front line and learns about command and control. Britain had the right planes and the right pilots, but to win the Battle of Britain needed something else. A system to put the men and machines into the right place at the right time.